Even though there are only two chapters in this unit, they're pretty big, and that's why we only have the two chapters, and they cover the time period of around 1935 to 1945, at least the first chapter does. And this is when jazz was the most popular in America. We will be talking about swing style and lots of big band leaders in this time period. So if we start right away with chapter 6, the first thing you have listed on this outline are the names of Benny Goodman, Tommy Dorsey, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, and Glenn Miller, and they're all very important band leaders of this time. Probably Benny Goodman's most important. If you look at him, you can see there a little bit lower on the yellow, it says he's the king of swing. Remember that. And it's good to read a bit about him and how he became famous and how he actually kind of started the entire swing popular era. And that story in the book's kind of interesting. His biggest contribution or interest, though, is also his take on race relations. The idea basically that he thought hiring the best musicians was way more important than what color the musicians were. And anyway, it's a good read, and you should definitely do that. Before you get into all of those guys, read about Fletcher Henderson. He's part of the listening to his song Wrapping It Up, and he's an important musician of this time, not so much as a band leader, not that many people know him that way, but more in the sense of being an orchestrator and somebody who took a lot of the music from the early jazz period by Paul Whiteman and taking that music and modernizing it to 1930s and 1940s sensibility. Everything's changing now. Everything's becoming bigger and modern. The old-fashioned now is going away, and teenagers and college-age kids are starting to spend more money and become more the target for big businesses. Jukeboxes are very popular. Think Happy Days kind of a thing. But big band music is over half of all record sales, and it actually helped to recover the music industry after the Depression. Jazz at this time is less improvisation. There's more chart reading, more music reading. The first big radio type of a thing is that one that you see right there next to those musicians' names. Your Hit Parade was a radio show, and it's kind of an archetype. It's the ancestor of MTV and VH1 and all that kind of good stuff, or American Bandstand. It was basically the program that let America know what was popular. Right now we have streaming, so you have to kind of do it that way, but back then they had the show Your Hit Parade, and DJs started getting introduced. Disc jockeys is what that stands for, and it's not like nowadays. It's more like a radio thing where the guy would talk at the radio while the music was being played, and of course that has morphed into house music and everything that we do nowadays. There's a nice quote about some archbishop on page 158, I believe it is, quoting this new music, and like always, new music always makes old people angry. Some of the more important areas of this time are these clubs. These are important clubs of the time that helped disseminate the music. In New York's Harlem district, you had the Savoy, the Cotton Club, and the Apollo. Popular dances like the Lindy Hop were extremely, everybody was doing it. Lindy is Charles Lindbergh, the first guy to fly solo by himself across the Atlantic, and they named a dance after him. This entire area of New York, the Harlem area, was so popular and so fashionable, and it took a very poor area and just infused it with people and activity. It was called the Harlem Renaissance. And people that were in the center of all this, sometimes catering to stereotypes and whatnot, were Duke Ellington and Cab Calloway. That kind of jungle music with the thumping drums and whatnot, what people wanted to think of as, exotic type of music. These clubs were very famous for offering that kind of a thing. And it was a very very big mix of racial relationships too. This was a place that was not your standard fare. It was for young, happening people. Um, Even though all those clubs were at the time owned by Jewish and Italian mobsters, it was a little different. But Benny Goodman, again, a big pioneer at this time, and listen to his music, and it's a lot of it is still being done. These bands, by the way, the Benny Goodman Band, the Tommy Dorsey Band, all of these bands still exist. Obviously, not led by the originals, but being led by band leaders that still play their music and try to keep that style alive. As a matter of fact, I know the Glenn Miller Band comes through Lawton almost every year, if I'm not mistaken. Duke Ellington is a little bit different than some of the others, basically because he's not coming out of a lower or poverty type of a class thing. He was born in Washington, D.C., middle class family, educated musically, actually considered quite a competent musician. And also, his frontline instrument, unlike the others, is a piano. Count Basie and Ellington are pianists. Benny Goodman was a clarinetist. Dorsey and Miller were trombone, if I remember correctly. And that's how you can kind of tell what band is playing just by those frontline instruments. Count Basie was born in New Jersey, moved to Kansas City. He's actually known in the Tulsa area quite a bit. Glenn Miller, as I mentioned before, who was alive from 1904 to 1944, died in the war, was probably and still is considered the most popular big band of all time. And it wouldn't hurt to read about that. Besides the big band of this time, there were the other fairly popular style of music was called vocal harmony groups, like the Mills Brothers, and there's a listening example of that. Think Boys to Men or NSYNC or something like that. It's just that idea of a group of people, singers together, singing in tight harmony. And as always, there's always going to be a style, and this is a kind of a jazzy style, but not quite big band. The book also wants to cover a little bit about country music and its rise in the swing era, and there's even a little bit of a crossover that we'll get into. Bob Wills and the Texas Playboys, very much a country group, but they did big band music, so we have a thing called country swing. I'll go into that a little bit more. The big name there is Roy Acuff. He's extraordinarily important. At this time, there are now over 600 hillbilly, that's what it was called back then, hillbilly radio stations, because people are really liking this new, authentic, even exotic type of a sound. Even famous singers like Bing Crosby and the Andrews Sisters are covering country music, which is, a kind of a validation of that. But Roy Acuff got his start. He was going to be a famous baseball player, but he had a heat stroke or something, and he went and became a country singer. 1903, 1992. He was a regular on the Grand Ole Opry, played the fiddle, the banjo, guitar. He just was a very charismatic gentleman, and if you watch some of his videos, it seems old-fashioned and whatnot, but he really knew how to resonate with listeners. He also formed, I believe, the very first country music publishing company that was exclusively country music. You might double check that, but that should be in your book also. At the same time, in the movies, singing cowboy movies were all the rage. There were just hundreds and hundreds of this. Gene Autry made over 90 movies where it was just basically the same story over and over, cowboys and the bad guys, and basically singing songs while they were going along. This paved the way for people like Roy Rogers and the Sons of the Pioneers. Listen to Cool Water. It's a great song. It's probably going to be on the test also. We got Patsy Cline, Tex Ritter, Asleep at the Wheel. All of these folks were in movies singing for the people going to that. It was a very specific style. But again, Bob Wills, he got a start in Tulsa and moved to California, developed Western swing, which is basically, again, your country instruments, your guitars and banjos and bass, but adding your big band instruments, all those saxophones and brass type instruments. And they did everything. They did blues, boogie woogie, just all the big band sound. They also included Tejano and Mexican influences. Um, Take a listen to San Antonio Rose. Again, it's a real famous old tune of basically it'll give you a good idea of what country swing sounds like. The Latin music in the swing era is primarily based on a lot of Cuban influences because Cuba is still a very popular vacation destination for Americans. Dances at the time were the calypso, the beguine, the tango, the bolero, the cha-cha, the samba. You can read about those. Xavier Cugat was probably the most popular performer at this time, considered the rumba king. He was born in Spain but moved to Havana and later New York, Los Angeles, and did movies also. Again, that's kind of important. Desi Arnaz, Lucille Ball's husband, played in his band. If that doesn't mean anything to you, don't worry about it. It's just for us older folks. And there were others too later on that came out of this. Tito Puente and Santana even come out of this era, but that's for later. Big band does decline, and there's a number of reasons the book goes into. This is a very important test question, so do realize that there was a big musician union strike from 1942 to 44, which for whatever reason, partly businesses, partly the unions, but when people go on strike, the music just doesn't happen. There were also many war shortages, so you couldn't use gas to travel, vehicles, plastics for records. All of these restrictions, even radio usage. Radio had to be carefully monitored so it wasn't picked up by the enemy, basically. Enlistment. A lot of musicians were signing up to go to war and dying, and they were being taken out of big band. There was even a 20% entertainment tax that was being levied, again, to help for the war. But primarily, the decline of the big bands happened, well, I would also assume because people were just wanting something new, but it was expensive, these huge bands. There was war rationing, radio wartime restrictions, and entertainment taxes, and the union strike. It's a big test question, so take a look at that, and that's chapter 6.